The Elder Scrolls Online now has 7 classes, with the most recent one added in June of this year. As I haven't made any class tier lists since last year and there's a new patch out right now, I'd like to update this information and put it in a written version on my website as well. The 2 questions to ask in this video are how the 7 classes rank in PvP compared to each other and how big these differences between classes are. Tier lists usually start from the F tier, which basically means unplayable, and go towards S tier, the absolute best spot offering everything you could wish for in a class. This class tier list will start at the D tier, representing a lower middle performance in PvP. There's currently no class that is lower than that in my eyes, as I find all of them to be at least playable on the right build. And the first class that occupies this D tier spot is Necromancer. Necromancer does have decent survivability, offering a burst heal and good passive damage reduction, but it lacks damage. It also does not feature a good crowd control option, leaving most Necromancer builds relying on Agony Totem or Dawnbreaker as their only CC. Skeletal Grasp, its class root and CC skill, got a buff some time ago, but this is still not enough to make it any valuable. Many argue this makes the class terrible, but I would counter that because this class is able to survive and tank decently well. And luckily it can make up for its lack of damage by using the current iteration of a proc set meta, with sets like Master Dual Wield, Veteran Ice Staff, Dragon's Appetite, Marselok and Zaan. This means that the Necromancer is best off being carried by sets, but it's not the only class like that. It's also a reason to argue that the Necromancer toolkit itself is not that strong, which is the reason it doesn't go any higher than D tier. Next up is Templar at C tier, offering an easy but nothing special setup that is quick to learn but difficult to get good at. Like Necromancer, it offers good healing, especially when the Templar is able to hold his or her ground in a specific spot. The problem is that the damage is pretty lackluster in practice, despite most Templar builds being able to push really high spell damage stats. Its burst ability, Purifying Light or Power the Light, has been nerfed significantly to the point where even a buff last patch couldn't make it any more than mediocre in PvP. The signature spam ball, jabs or puncturing sweeps, is undodgeable and an area of effect, offering average damage that is easily mitigated by major evasion. Thus, the main build goal for Templars is to create burst through their sets. There's 3 general specs for this class: a Magicka focused melee setup, a hybrid melee setup and a ranged setup. The melee setups will usually consist of Rallying Cry, Mechanical Acuity and optionally Balor. 2 of these sets create the burst Templars lack in their class toolkit, and players are pretty much locked into using these. Ranged setups in fact do have bursts of their own, with the high damage uncounterable combination of Meteor, Javelin and Radiant Oppression. Still, using Balork is preferable as this burst requires an ultimate, so you better make it count. Commonly used sets here are Rallying Cry and Rush Fatality. With all this, Templar can definitely be a viable class, especially in group context. But the only thing that excels in its toolkit is Radiant Oppression, an easy and dare I say oppressive undodgeable ranged execute, which holds the crown over all the other execute skills in the game. Thus, this mix of a lack of burst that needs to be supported by sets, decent survivability and an excellent execute makes Templar a prime example of an average class at C tier. After Templar there is Sorcerer at B tier. Sorcerer offers a very mobile and versatile toolkit with varying effectiveness depending on whether you choose to go with a Magicka or hybrid version. Magicka Sorcerer is the weaker of the Sorcerer specs, but it's still playable after some buffs it received, and since it's my main, I can definitely attest to it being a lot of fun again. Hybrid and Stamina specs are the stronger Sorcerer versions that use the class toolkit most often in conjunction with proc sets for an effective setup with excellent pressure and mobility. Those proc sets would be the same as what I mentioned for Necromancer, and you can tell that this build carries a lot because of how often I have to reiterate it. Based purely on this latter build spec, Sorcerer could be classified as A tier, but I want to keep Magicka Sorcerer into account as well, which brings it down a little. In the end, none of these specs have the survivability of the classes following either. The Arcanist is the newest class that has been out for a few months now, and while its visual and auditive design is nice, it does not outshine the latter classes in this list. Interestingly, this is the first time a new class is not an S tier on release, and gets a place in A tier instead. The best part of its toolkit is defense, with builds that offer max health giving both more healing and an easier time in PvP. You can take a lot of risk on this class, especially with Runeguard of Freedom, and it simply takes more damage to take down the target with 40k health. I personally think it's a shame that this mechanic is added again because it's not healthy for the PvP experience when high health builds are promoted like this. Tied to survivability is Sustain, which is good on paper due to the Arcanist passives giving high base regeneration stats. In practice, the active skills cost a lot of resources though, making this class a little difficult to sustain at times. Nothing that cannot be fixed by a slight investment in sustaining your build though. The 2 skill lines for defense and 1 for offense brings me to the next point, damage issues. Again on paper, this class has some really high damage skills, with Fate Carver providing one of the highest burst skill tooltips in the game. But in practice, this burst skill does not hit moving players, due to the late aiming and the natural server position desync. The only way to actually hit the skill is if an enemy is not moving, either due to being rooted, stunned, or being stuck in an enclosed space. Hitting a moving target results in constant misses as the beam does not appear to damage even if you are perfectly following a running opponent. When you instead aim in front of where an enemy is going, you'll notice Fate Carver hitting more reliably, suggesting a delay between what your client sees and what's actually happening on the server side. This leads many Arcanist builds, including my own, to yet again resort to proc sets to carry their damage instead, since the constant pressure from that goes well with the natural tankiness of the class, Rune of the Colorless Pool and the Tight King's Gaze. Warden is a good class that is best played with a stamina brawler setup, stacking high health for survivability and relying on two-handed builds. There are also Frost Wardens, which form a rather unique and fun playstyle where you try to apply a lot of pressure using Frost damage abilities together with Warden abilities. This class can be extremely easy to play defensively, especially when going with a high health build, which is very forgiving when making mistakes. Offensively, this class is a little more tricky to play, since ideally you make burst with the second hit of Deep Fissure, which has a long delay. Dizzying Swing has some peculiar mechanics to it as well, and requires getting good at timing the second hit of Deep Fissure with other damage abilities, such as a stun from Dizzying Swing, a partly charged two-handed heavy attack, or Dawnbreaker. If you get all that right though, this class has some of the highest area of effect burst damage achievable in the game, and this together with the Resident Sleeper survivability makes it worth of E tier. Unsurprisingly, you could also just run proc sets for an easier time dealing a lot of prolonged damage together with some class skills and the same Deep Fissure and Dawnbreaker burst combination. Dragonknight builds are pretty good at everything, offering healing, resistance, sustain and damage. Damage is provided through some really good pressure skills as well as excellent ultimates. The only part one could argue being missing is mobility, since its mobility skill, Protective Plate, only has snare and root immunity. But that's probably for the better too, since it is possible to build in mobility regardless with Race Against Time, Elusive Mist or Swift Jewelry without sacrificing much in any other department. Players that focus on fighting in enclosed areas can also make excellent use of Cinderstorm, which strongly reduces the enemy's mobility rather than increasing their own. Builds use the common meta sets, with Bloodspawn and Daedric Trickery being the most popular. These sets are good for survivability, but also significantly boost ultimate generation. That goes hand in hand with the Dragonknight's passive Battle Roar, which gives Magicka and stamina back on ultimate use. So not only do you get to use Corrosive or Leap more often, which are excellent ultimates in their own right, you also get a lot of sustain from this high ultimate generation. It's one of the few classes that has good damage over time pressure without needing to use proc sets. Curiously, on top of that it has some of the highest single target burst as well. If you've ever encountered Dragonknights using a setup with Mechanical Acuity, Corrosive Armor and Molten Whip, it's an experience that is hard to forget. The survivability is procured by the sets, a good burst heal in the form of Coagulating Blood and extra healing from Vigor and Shattering Rocks. This is one hybridized build option for this class, but there's another very beloved spec, the proc set builds. I say this ironically, don't harass me in the comments please. Dragonknight is yet another class that this setup works very well with, and sustained pressure from class skills and proc sets is unparalleled. Either way, Dragonknight is one of the best classes and deserving of an S tier spot on the ladder. And the second S tier spot goes to Nightblade. This class has everything you could wish for as well, to the point where choosing skills on the build feels like going in a candy store. All parts of a build, damage, healing, sustain and mobility are covered by this class's own skills. You can lean into this by using mostly class skills in your Nightblade build, or spice it up by once again adding proc sets or trying an off-road spec like Bowblade or a ranged Magicka Nightblade. The best way to run this class is with a brawler build, which uses the natural extremely high burst damage of the class with a tankier setup in terms of resistances and healing. The burst damage you can put out with the Nightblade is virtually unparalleled by anything else in PvP, both for single target and AoE purposes. Single target wise, the prime burst example is with Incapacitating Strike, Merciless Resolve and Concealed Weapon. The Nightblades that are easy to predict will simply try to follow up an incap with Merciless Resolve as a burst combo. but there's a lot of nuance that can be added by the better Nightblades. Since the increased damage taken debuff from Incap lasts so long now, you are not forced to immediately follow it up with Merciless. Good Nightblades will use this and the stun that occurs when using a partly charged heavy attack after applying off balance with concealed weapon to surprise their opponents with harder to predict burst combos. These offensive mechanics are similar for the more mobile Roller Nightblades and the tankier Brawler Nightblades. Roller Nightblades are a more stamina focused setup. Those rely on shadowy disguise and roll dodge to apply a guerrilla fighting style, coming in quickly to burst an enemy and retreating immediately afterwards, regardless if their chosen victim died or not. This is an older and in my opinion more unique and fun playstyle than the Brawler Nightblade. Brawlers trade some of this mobility for a playstyle that is slower and tankier, meaning it relies less intensely on positioning and thus brings less risk. Ganking and bombing are two other strong Nightblade specs, where the player sacrifices all survivability to maximize damage and uses a one-shot combo to end the fight a few seconds after it began. Ganking is when this happens for single target damage. Bombing is for area of effect applications to wipe out entire groups of enemies in the blink of an eye. It is also because of this wide variety of specs that Nightblade offers that this class is one of the S-tier options in PvP at the moment. As this class has received buff after buff throughout the recent patches, the future is looking bright for Nightblades as well. Whether this is something that will get noticed or followed up on by the devs is something that only time will tell. I for one am looking forward to when the wheel turns once more upon the Magicka Sorcerer.